Speaking to some in DC and diplomatic world, they wonder if the window of opportunity was really a year ago to show some of these things, and it might be a bit too late in Donald Trump's mind. But he is someone who talks big, and then may find that actually where it ends is not quite. If you think about how he talks about doing these deals, it is often, you ask for something that you can't necessarily get, and you see what you come back with. You sue places for these huge numbers, and then you tend to settle for less.
There'll be a packed conference hall this afternoon in Davos as they wait to hear from the most powerful man in the world, President Donald J. Trump. He spoke at length last night, perhaps a dress rehearsal for today. He said we'd have to wait and see what he'll do about Greenland and stuck with his opposition to the Chagos deal. It wasn't clearly entirely understood what the Chagos deal was. What can we expect to hear from the president later, and how should Europe and our allies react? That's very much the question of the morning. We can speak now to the Times Washington editor, Katy Balls, who's joining us from Davos. Katy, morning to you.
Morning.
So what, I mean, I guess the multi-billion-dollar question here is, what do you think Trump is seeking to get out of his 28 hours at Davos?
Well, the trip has been in the works for some time, long before the recent blow-up over Greenland. Now, of course, he was speaking about Greenland when he first returned to the White House, but right now, in a week like this, it feels like all the news is coming back to that. But if you look at previous speeches Donald Trump has given at Davos, he's often had a business message. I think his first one in 2018, he barely touched on geopolitics. That was not the main takeaway for him. So you can expect it to come up, but we're also hearing he wants to talk about the economy, housing, and Donald Trump's speeches tend to be wide-ranging, so I'm sure he can fit a lot in. But I think the domestic backdrop is Donald Trump has the midterms later this year. So initially, at least, this Davos trip was largely economy focused when you spoke to those around the president. Now, of course, it feels as though it's naturally going to straight whether on stage or perhaps more in the private conversations to what he thinks about his counterparts across the world and how he wants to reshape America and the world.
And I guess on that point, is it plausible in his own mind or in the mind of the administration that he can talk to people outside of the speech and get some sort of deal on Greenland? Because he keeps doing what he often does, talking up what's about to happen. And he says that Greenland is going to happen. Is there a mechanism by which it could happen this week?
I think with these things, it's all about the negotiation. And I think it's been interesting. You had Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, speaking both today but also yesterday. And yesterday he was calling for calm, saying European leaders don't overreact, don't retaliate. This is all like Liberation Day with the tariffs, when it seemed very dramatic and actually there was a landing zone afterwards. That was the implication. Of course, there are some saying, well, why do we have to be calm when the president's not? But perhaps that's the power balance that is America versus some of these countries, which means that he can do these things and Europeans have to think more strategically. But I think the big question is, is there a middle ground when it comes to security on Greenland? But you would expect this issue to be coming up in conversations while he's here.
But what is the middle ground? And that also presupposes that security is his main issue when it comes to Greenland, where he has a base there. It has 700 people on it or 200 people on it. He could put 10,000 people on it if he wanted to, soldiers, if he really cared about security. If he doesn't want security, what's the middle ground beyond him taking Greenland?
Well, security is clearly an aspect of it. The other things that you can look to is Donald Trump's legacy. Is he trying to do it because he wants to be one of the few presidents that expands the map of America? And then, of course, you can get to, Greenland, oil, and so forth. Is there something there that would be interesting to America? But I think if suddenly European leaders started taking the security of Greenland more seriously, and when they sent troops, not sending such a tiny number as they did the other week, which obviously backfired in many ways and looked a little bit performative, would that be something that would soothe it? I think speaking to some in DC and diplomatic world, they wonder if the window of opportunity was really a year ago to show some of these things, and it might be a bit too late in Donald Trump's mind. But he is someone who talks big and then may find that actually where it ends is not quite. If you think about how he talks about doing these deals, it is often, you ask for something that you can't necessarily get and you see what you come back with. You sue places for these huge numbers and then you tend to settle for less.
Yeah, maybe that's precisely what he's doing. Katy, really good to speak to you. Let's see what happens over the next few hours or so. That's Katy Balls, though, the Times Washington editor. She's got a new podcast, actually, with Jerry Baker, we heard yesterday, the US State of It. So the version of the State of It Times podcast about UK politics. There's a US version with Katy Balls and Jerry Baker. Should we talk about inflation? We probably
Let's talk about inflation.
Let's speak again to the Times business editor, Richard Fletcher. Morning, Richard.
Good morning.
You're in Davos, but the inflation figures from this country have come out. 3.4% prices rose in the year to December. That's up from 3.2%. This was predicted, wasn't it, Richard?
It was predicted. I mean, this is slightly higher than was expected. So economists had expected inflation of 3.3%. I'm always cautious about monthly economic data, and we should be particularly cautious about December because it has been skewed by airfares. So the ONS collects data on what's called index day, and it looks like they've chosen the second of those dates. And obviously in December, airfare prices rise quite dramatically in the run up to Christmas, and they also take into account the return flight, and as that would have been between Christmas and New Year, that would also have been expensive. So we should be slightly cautious about these numbers. In general, economists expect the pace of inflation to slow sharply in the coming months. So this does look like a little bit of a blip, although still concerning, and inflation is proving very stubborn. I mean, I think economists will probably take some joy from the fact that core inflation, so that excludes energy and food and alcohol and tobacco, that's actually just a steady month on month, and also services inflation is up by just 0.1%. So yeah, so it obviously does show that inflation is stubborn, but we should be cautious about reading into 1 month's numbers. Tobacco prices also driving inflation higher after the increase in the budget.
I'm always struck, Richard, I'm interested in your thoughts on this because I'm a non-expert in this area, but just how crude our approach to the economy is, that we have these inflation figures, and if they go up, we put interest rates up, effectively to sort of stall growth, really, to sort of get us as close to a recession without having a recession in order that inflation comes down. It's a very crude way of operating. Is that the only tool that's really available? Inflation goes up, we try and crash the economy just enough to get inflation down again.
Well, I'm sure the Monetary Policy Committee would tell you they're not just looking at the one inflation number, and they're looking at lots of different numbers. And they also do obviously look very closely at the labour market. But yeah, there has been at numerous times in the last decade or so arguments about whether the MPC's target should purely be about inflation, because, as you say, that their target is to get to 2% inflation, and the only tool they really have is to slow the economy. So should they have a broader range of targets is a debate that crops up every now and again.
Because if we had high growth, high inflation wouldn't matter so much, and in fact, there's probably a happy world where inflation above 2% matched by growth would be the thing we wanted.
Yeah, no, absolutely, of course, but people do worry that, and we may see this in the US in a couple of years, that those pesky politicians perhaps drive the economy as fast as they can, and that results in high inflation in a couple of years later, when perhaps they may not be in office anymore.
Oh, interesting point. Yeah, it just strikes me as a relatively crude way of doing things, but maybe there's no better. Richard, great to speak to you. You're in Davos. We'll be hearing from you, no doubt, again as Davos gets hotter and hotter, metaphorically, with Trump's arrival later on. That's Richard Fletcher, our business editor, the Times' business editor.